7 days grace period is given, so interest and things like that only start charging from the 7th of the month. But it is very important that the trustees must pass that resolution and must notify the owners within 14 days after the AGM of what the levies are and how they're payable. If we can go to the next slide, it basically covers the calculation of levies. So levies are a function of the expenses. You cannot really compare two complexes with each other because their budgets will differ, the list of expenses will differ. So to do a budget, you draw up a list of expenses and then the levies will be raised to cover those expenses. And yeah, as I said, each complex has different expenses and therefore will have different levies. So the budget is approved at the annual general meeting. The levies are then raised to be able to cover that. We normally work on a break even or a little surplus. And I'm not talking about reserve funds, that's something different. I'm just talking about the admin fund. We will work on a break-even budget, because we don't need to make a profit there. The budget must be approved by the owners. It's normally done at a general meeting by ordinary resolution of the owners. And for instance, during lockdown, we had the case where owners couldn't get together physically. So we had virtual meetings, or the owners approved the budgets on a round robin basis. But there's always a way to approve a budget, even if you can't get together for a physical meeting. Then the Act also gives the trustees the right to increase the levies by a maximum of 10% without approval from the owners. So normally they would need approval from the owners, they would need a budget to be approved, but the trustees has given the owners the right because they realized that the financial year end is, for instance, December, but the AGM will only be held in February, March, April. So by that time, we've lost a couple of months of the year, so that they've given the trustees in the Act the opportunity and the authority to increase the levies from the beginning of the financial year end, but to a maximum of 10% without approval from the owners. If they want more than 10%, they have to wait for the first general meeting. Otherwise, they can't do it. Then levies are normally calculated based on the participation quotas of the section, but it is possible for a complex to change that so that you work on nominated values instead of the participation quotas. Participation quotas is determined by the size of the unit. The bigger your unit, the bigger your participation quota, the higher your levy will be. Then if we look at special levies, the Act allows for the trustees to raise special levies over and above the normal levies, but they can't just willy-nilly do it. It can only be done in instances where it is needed for unbudgeted urgent expenses. If it is possible to wait for the next budget, they have to wait, but they can raise special levies for unbudgeted urgent expenses. And the special levies are then determined again by trustee resolution. The trustees decide the installments. They could say we're raising this special levy over 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months, however many months. Put an end date, a beginning date and an end date to it. And the special levies must then also be calculated in terms of either the participation quotas or the nominated values if the complex works on nominated values. Then the next slide. Another type of levy that we have in a sectional title complex is the CSOS levy. So the CSOS Act, the Community Schemes Ombud Service Act, came into force on the 7th of October 2016. And this Act stipulates that all community schemes, including sectional title schemes, must pay a levy to CSOS. The minister then made regulations with regards to the formula for that for the CSOS levy, and you can see it there on your screen, how to calculate the CSOS levy. It must be paid monthly to the body corporate, and it must be paid quarterly to CSOS. CSOS then also in their regulations stipulated an interest rate that they can charge on arrear CSOS levies. Okay, then we look at action that can be taken in terms of arrear levies. So the Act gives the trustees the right to raise interest on arrear levies, but there must be a trustee resolution for this. We call it the interest resolution, where the trustees decide on an interest rate that is charged to owners on arrear levies, and this interest is then income for the body corporate. It's normally not budgeted for because it's an extra income, and this gets reviewed annually. A suggested interest rate would be something like 15%. We suggest that you don't use prime as a decider. Don't say prime plus 2 or prime plus 3, because otherwise it leads to unnecessary calculations. When it goes to court, we have to then determine what prime was at a certain stage to be able to calculate what the interest rate was at that stage. Huge calculations to be done. The Act also says that the interest rate may not exceed the maximum rate of interest payable per annum under the National Credit Act, and that currently stands at 24% per year. So 15%, good suggestion to have. Before the new Act, the Sectional Title Schemes Management Act, came into force on the 7th of October 2016, the body corporate only had the right to hand over defaulting owners to attorneys for collection. But since the new Act, since October 2016, such cases may also be handed to the CSOS Ombudsman, which is obviously quicker and cheaper than handing them over to attorneys and going to court. But we'll talk about that whole procedure later on. And then the Act also stipulates that a member is liable for all reasonable legal costs and disbursements as taxed or agreed by the member that the body corporate incurred in collecting the arrear levies or other amounts. So everything that the body corporate has to pay, or the cost that the body corporate has to incur, the owner will ultimately be liable for that. But we'll talk about that later as well. And then debt collection by the managing agent. So us as Trafalgar, we're the managing agents. For us to collect the levies for a complex, we have to be registered as debt collectors with the Council of Debt Collectors, because we're collecting it on behalf of, so we are a third party. And the Council of Debt Collectors has a code of conduct that we have to adhere to, and they have a prescribed fee structure that we can charge. We can only charge a certain amount for letters, certain amount for phone calls, certain amount for different things. We cannot charge over and above that. And then they also have a dispute resolution service. If there are any debt collection complaints that are forwarded to them, they will use the dispute resolution service for that. And I think that was my last slide, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you, Karine. Just two questions, if we can maybe pose them to you at this stage. The first is from Mike. The 10% permitted levy increase at the end of the financial year, which the trustees are authorized to approve, does that only apply to the admin fund, or can it also be applied to the reserve fund levies as well?
That's only on the admin fund levy.
Okay, and that's only then to be implemented at the first of the new financial year. So they would need to then decide that by the first. Would they need to write the letter to the owners as well, informing them of that 10% levy increase?
Yeah, after they've passed the trustee resolution, they have to inform the owners, and then they can charge it. But they have to do it at the end of at the beginning of the financial year, end of the last financial year. They cannot do it a couple of months down the line and then backdate the levies. They cannot do that.
Yeah. All right. So just for everyone to be aware, then it's quite regular and normal then for a body corporate to have 2 levy increases in the year. So, for example, the trustees might decide they would like to exercise their authority and the opportunity to increase levies right from the beginning of the financial year up to 10%. It doesn't have to be 10%, but can be anything up to 10%. Normally, there would be a budget that's prepared to inform that. And normally the trustees would review that budget, and we call it a trustee approved budget. So that would be the first levy increase. And then if there was an increase required beyond 10% to meet the forecast expenses, for example, if there was a significant project or more that was going to increase expenses, then they would need to then propose an extra increase at the annual general meeting when the budget is presented at the AGM for approval there. And then typically the levies might increase again in the month after the AGM. So that's why there could be 2 levy increases during the year. We do recommend that the levies are adjusted in the first month of the new financial year, because it does smooth a much larger increase later in the year, because you get increased income right from the beginning of the financial year, and you don't lose that opportunity of increased income waiting for the AGM, which is normally in the 3rd or the 4th month of the financial year. So we find that if the levies are promptly adjusted based on a new budget for the new financial year, it will make sure that there's not a much higher increase after the AGM in that 3rd or 4th month. So just something to be aware of there in terms of what can be done. Then I'd just like to emphasize that the governance documentation to support the correct charging and billing of levies is absolutely essential, because if it's not correctly in place, it can compromise legal efforts to recover those levies. So the documents in question are the levy resolution, which Karine mentioned, that needs to be signed by the trustees to confirm that levies will be raised typically monthly in advance. But if that document's not in place and not correctly signed off, it can certainly undermine a legal process to collect arrear levies. And it's also important that there's the interest resolution to justify interest, otherwise that could be disallowed as well. And we normally take care of those documents at the first trustee meeting after the AGM when the trustees are collected. And we then present the trustees with a pack of these resolutions to sign off. It also helps them with awareness of what interest is being charged, of how the levies are billed and invoiced, and the documentation to support that. And it's a good reminder in the process, but really important to have that in place. And we're personally busy with an issue where an owner has refused to pay levies because this document is not in place, and we're finding it very difficult to support the legal process. And this is from, before we took on the building that this arose, and it's very difficult to now recreate it after the fact. So important to be pedantic, to be accurate, to be, absolutely meticulous in having these in place so that there's no issue with the legal process which might be required. So I'd just like to emphasize that for everyone as well. It's also important to know that the owners do need to be notified within 2 weeks of a levy increase needed to be being decided in writing, and that does need to go out to advise them. That again is an important governance requirement. So typically after the annual general meeting, if levies are going to be increased and it was decided and approved with the budget at the AGM, we as the managing agents would need to write to all the owners to explain to them what the levy increase is going to be, when that would be applicable from, and that would then reflect on the next levy statement, which is normally sent out around the 20th, 24th, depending on weekends. And we would put a statement message on the levy statements as well, just to remind that there has been a levy adjustment. We often ask questions, what do my levies pay for? What is the breakdown of my levies? And the simple answer to that is the budget is the breakdown of the levies. So the approved budget, as per what's presented at the AGM, it's included in the AGM agenda pack. That gives each and every expense item, it gives the expense, cost forecast, and, referring to the budget then shows exactly what the levies pay for. Okay, and as Karine said, the levies are set to cover the costs. So whatever the costs will be will drive the levies, and it's necessary that the levy income, matches or slightly exceeds the costs. Maybe just a point on the interest as well, that interest is taxable in the hands of the body corporate, although there's a 50,000 Rand taxable income exemption for body corporates. So body corporates do need to register with SARS for tax. Levies are exempt in terms of taxable income. There's the limit of 50,000, but if the building is earning revenue in terms of rental or interest or other income, there is tax at 28% charged on income above 28%. So it's important to be aware of that, because that interest income which comes into the building can have tax implications which need to be considered and budgeted for. And very often that interest raised on these arrear levy accounts doesn't come in regularly because the owners are not paying their levies. That's why there's interest in the first place, and it would need to be collected through a debt collection or legal process, which Benazir is going to talk to us about shortly. We've got one or two other questions which I'll just go through, but if I can hand over to my colleague Benazir Ghulam now. Benazir is one of our 2 national debt collection managers, and Benazir is going to talk us through the pre-legal collection process applied by Trafalgar as a debt collector and what's all involved. So Benazir, if I could hand over to you. Thank you.
Hi everyone. So we're going to discuss the pre-legal process that's followed by Trafalgar. This is prior to the legal collections. So first up, we're going to look at a flow chart for collectors, a few topics for discussion, the Debt Collectors Act, TPN Credit Bureau blacklisting, and the handover to attorneys for soft collections, and a few important tips. Okay, first of all, what we've done is we've created a flow chart just to show the process that a debt collector will follow. First of all, the debt collector will try and make contact telephonically. If there is no contact via telephone, we will send an email or a WhatsApp or a letter. If we further don't have a response, the estate manager or caretaker will assist us in advising us whether there's anyone in the unit. If we still cannot find the owner, we will then trace, and all efforts in debt collection are put onto the Unibase system, which is the system that Trafalgar uses, onto the notepad. So all entries, if contact was made, if there was a voicemail, if an SMS was sent or a letter, then the debt collector will put that information onto the notepad on Unibase. Okay, our debt collectors have a target of approximately 30 or more calls per day, more or less 20 incoming and 20 outgoing, to make sure that they make telephonic contact with the owner to discuss their arrear levies. Okay, the next slide. Okay, what is soft collections? So we're just going to highlight the difference between soft collections and hard collections. This comprises of all efforts to collect the arrear levies prior to handing over to attorneys. So as I mentioned before, the debt collector will make calls, send reminder letters, SMSs, and attend to payment arrangements with owners. It is important to note that these efforts to collect levies attract debt collection charges, which all managing agents will charge, as they are registered with the Debt Collectors Council and are mandated to charge these fees. Okay, what are the tools that Trafalgar employs to make contact and locate the debtors? We have the CPB tracing tool. We use the internet, LinkedIn, as well as WhatsApp to try and make contact. We've also recently employed Facebook. Tracing is a necessary tool in the collection process. We have to ensure that we have all the correct contact details of the debtor prior to hand over to attorneys. The attorneys that we hand over to may also employ the services of a tracer on a no trace, no fee basis. Therefore, if there is no trace, then we will not pay that tracer. The trace is essential as the attorneys must be able to serve the letter of demand and the further legal documents that will follow. Okay, how can the body corporate work together, or the HOA work together with the managing agent? The caretakers and or trustees or directors may assist the debt collectors with locating an owner or providing information. So we do require feedback as to whether the owner is living in the unit or if there's a tenant, so that we know where to serve our legal documents. Okay, the next slide. Okay, what is the Debt Collectors Act? So this is the legislation that applies to all debt collectors. A debt collector shall not recover from a debtor any amount other than the capital amount of a debt due and interest due and payable thereon for the period during which the capital amount remains unpaid. So in terms of 19(1)(b), any necessary expenses and fees, which is mentioned in Annexure B, which we can provide, which will list all the charges, for example, how much a letter will cost, how much an SMS will cost, the different types of calls. For example, if a call is made where an arrangement is done, then it's a consultation fee that will be raised. So this is all in terms of 19(1)(a) and B, and we are mandated to charge these fees as a managing agent. Okay, TPN Credit Bureau and blacklisting. So blacklisting is for all those accounts that are 3 months in arrears, where we have sent a 15 letter of demand. The 15 letter will stipulate that an owner has been 20 days in arrears, and we are notifying you, sorry, 3 months in arrears and 20 days have passed, and we now will blacklist you. The blacklist status will not be removed until the account is paid up to date. So in order for the blacklist profile to be removed, you must settle the account. The blacklisting will negatively affect the credit score of the owner and severely affect the ability to obtain any credit funding facilities in the market. Furthermore, TPN blacklisting limits the prospects of a tenant to enter into a lease agreement and allows property owners to perform the necessary checks. All data is exported to the TPN Credit Bureau to ensure accurate monitoring of arrears.
All right, can I just pause you there, Benazir, and just sort of explain one or two things in more detail. So just for everyone to be aware, twice a month, Trafalgar exports levy payment data to TPN, which is a credit bureau. So on the 10th and at the end of the month, we're exporting payment data, which will show what charges were raised on each account, what was paid, and when it was paid. And based on that information, TPN as a credit bureau is then calculating and tracking credit scores for those owner accounts. So that's what happens. It's an electronic process and it's a global process which covers all of the units Trafalgar manages. When that payment data is exported, the owners who have negative payment data, meaning that they either short paid or they paid their levy charges late, they will get a text message from TPN explaining that their credit score has been adversely affected because they have not paid their charges in full. Now, why do we do this? Why do we go to the effort of using a credit bureau in this way for the purposes of debt collection? And the answer to that is that we are using this as leverage to persuade owners to pay their levy accounts in full and to avoid any late or incomplete payments, because there are implications to them in terms of either renting properties or borrowing from banks for motor car finance or home finance or other forms of finance. So really we're using the TPN Credit Bureau as a lever, as a strong incentive for owners to pay promptly and to pay in full, because if they don't, there will be the adverse credit score and credit bureau listings which will affect them. And it's a very powerful lever and easily achieved through the automated payment exports that I've explained. Blacklisting itself is achieved by loading the ID number of the owner concerned on TPN's website. There will already be a payment profile that's being tracked because of the payment data we're exporting, and that blacklisting then is basically tracked on TPN's system, credit bureau system, and I believe they're exported to ITC as well. And then there are many sort of businesses and retailers that would use these credit bureaus for credit checks for consumer facilities or products, and that's where the blacklisting or the credit scoring becomes important. So we need to use all the leverage that we can find to incentivize and encourage and almost promote owners to take the payment of their levy seriously, to prioritize it, to make sure that they're focusing on paying it promptly. And in that way, a culture of prompt and full and effective levy payments is created, which is really, really important for consistent cash flow. And as I said, for a building's income to match its budgeted income, to be able to cover forecast costs and really to maintain service delivery at the building for the residents living there, so they're not disrupted in any way. And it's crucial that maintenance is part of that service delivery process. So with the pre-legal debt collection, we really are trying to use every measure we can without going to court, without getting attorneys involved, etc. Because when we talk about legal collections, you will see it's a very slow process, it's a very expensive process, and in those ways, it's not very satisfactory. So as much as possible, we're trying to collect the arrear levies pre-legal, before it goes legal. And, the telephone calls, the demand letters, the credit bureau, tracking and credit scoring and blacklisting are all important measures that we use pre-legally. And really the calls, I'd like to emphasize in particular, is critical as the first step, because really what we're trying to do is make contact with the owner concerned, make sure that they're aware of the charges, they're aware of the arrears, and that if they have any queries, there's a chance to resolve those. And very often an owner's been away, or they they haven't received their statement for whatever reason, or they don't understand the charges, or they have a query, and our debt collectors then must address those issues or those gaps to make it comfortable or to make it feasible for the owner to then pay their levies. So that's at the heart of pre-legal collections, that we are reaching out, we're making contact, we're calling owners in a personal way, and the whole tone that we'd like our debt collectors to approach with owners in arrears is one of helpfulness, that they are helping and assisting them to be aware of their charges, to understand what the outstanding balance is, to resolve any queries, and to assist them to bring their accounts up to date so they can avoid credit bureau issues, blacklisting issues, or even worse, legal fees if it goes into a legal handover process. So our debt collectors are then applying the code of conduct to be helpful, to be professional in that way, and it certainly does not need to be a confrontational exercise. So it's really important that this is a comprehensive exercise. It's actually the most important part of our debt collection because it's what's within our control. And I would say, hopefully in 80% of cases, these pre-legal debt collection measures can go a long way to resolving the arrears, especially if they're applied early, they're applied consistently, and they're applied in a helpful, positive, and friendly manner. So, Benazir, would you agree with that sort of further explanation of the pre-legal process?
Yes, definitely, Andrew. I do think that, sorry, I think there's a bit of echo there. I do think that it's important that we try and, push for every effort before we get to legal because of the expense, and also try to work that, owners and tenants work with the debt collectors to get a payment arrangement in place. That's quite important. What I'm going to discuss further is flagging of accounts. How we work at Trafalgar is that we employ a flagging system to enable the debt collectors to monitor the accounts. So for example, if you've set up a payment arrangement, on the system, it will be flagged as a P, where an acknowledgement of debt has been signed by the owner, so that we can track, these payments, monitor the payments going forward, and make sure that payments are coming in. We've also got a debit order flag for those owners that prefer to pay via debit order. I think that paying via debit order is important, and then you don't have to make a monthly EFT or so forth, or a cash payment, because it will just go off your account. The PC flag is a flag that was created specifically for the purpose of COVID, to assist owners that have been financially affected and whose accounts were up to date prior to COVID-19. So it's important to note that this kind of assistance is for those owners that were up to date, and unfortunately they've fallen into default due to being financially affected. We have mid-month payers that prefer to pay. It's usually government payers that get paid, at that time of the month, that prefer to pay on the 15th. And we have Q. The Q flag is where, for example, there's a query, a water, electricity, meter reading problem, and we flag it as a Q so that we are aware that there is a problem, and we won't raise any penalties or charges until the problem has been resolved. Okay, it is very important to note that levies cannot be written off. Unfortunately, levies are chargeable and there's no write-off, unfortunately. Okay, our next topic is handover to attorneys for soft collections. In the event that all attempts to collect their arrears internally have been exhausted, Trafalgar hands over to attorney firm called CDS, it's Cara de Souza Attorneys, to assist us with soft collections. The account will then be flagged as a SC in order for Trafalgar to monitor the account. The account remains with CDS attorneys for a period of no longer than 14 days. CDS will then attend to the following: a letter of demand, SMSs, WhatsApps, and email correspondence to all debtors, as well as concluding acknowledgements of debt agreements. CDS attorneys are an attorney firm registered with the Fidelity Fund and are able to raise all fees in terms of Annexure B of the Debt Collectors Act. In the event that CDS is not successful in collections or cannot make contact with the debtor, the file will then be closed, the flag will then be removed, and the file will then be moved over to attorneys for legal collections. So I just wanted to make mention that we do make every effort within the 3-month period of internally soft collecting, and further handing over to CDS attorneys, as the legal process is very expensive and takes a long time. So we really try and make contact, every effort to make contact with the owner.
And Azia, can I just add here that, for everyone, the reason that we we like the step, or we use the step, is that this is where owners are either ignoring or they're not responding to Trafalgar's soft collections. And soft collections is another term for pre-legal collections. So what we've tried to do is then use this attorney firm in this way to really make a last-ditch effort in a separate identity form for an attorney to then try and collect the arrears before a summons is issued and before the process becomes legal. So it's really to kind of, create a stern impression, to give the owners a last chance. If they're ignoring Trafalgar, they will then see a different identity, and they will see an attorney's name on this correspondence, which very often makes them take it more seriously. So it's for this reason that we apply this as a last step, where the collections process will move from pre-legal through this soft collection process using an attorney firm, and then it will be handed over to one of our panelist attorneys, generally, who will start the legal process with a letter of demand and a summons. So, this really is, the bottom line is, this shows the owner that we're serious. It's their last chance. If they've been ignoring Trafalgar, they'll now see an attorney's name, and we find that, in a large number of cases, this does have an impact, and it does tend to be successful in collecting levies before having to go legal. So that's just some extra explanation on this particular step. Okay.
Okay, just a few important tips regarding the pre-legal debt collection. Levy statements must be accurate, sent in advance before the first, and received by the owner. So we do check on our system whether the email address, delivers, and if not, we will trace. Eliminate any queries on the account promptly. That will be with the debt collector. Clarify utility queries and resolve with the meter reading service providers. Address maintenance issues and disputes. That will be with your portfolio manager. Make contact with the debtor trying to achieve a payment plan. Tracing systems are important for missing contact details. Emphasize important levers such as credit scores and blacklisting. Leverage centralized amenities such as hot water, communal facilities, fast-track entrances, and internet access and DSTV. That is where, for example, a biometric access will be limited, or if a communal DSTV is used. We do employ that debt collectors should engage with debtors in a polite and professional manner, applying the approach that they're assisting the client to catch up with their levy arrears, and consistent follow-ups are then made. So in our training, we like to employ that debt collectors must be empathetic, and bear in mind that they are collecting arrear levies at the same time.
Right, thanks, Benazir. If I can just maybe answer one or two questions, and referring to what you see here as important tips. So the first point to say is that levy statements must be accurate. That must eliminate any queries. If an owner does raise queries on their levy statement, we'll typically send them a reconciliation statement, which goes back to a zero balance, which will show all the charges raised on their account, all the payments made, and it will allow them to see the breakdown of their account and to double check that all the payments have been correctly allocated. So that's really important, that the statement must be accurate. Also that owners have received the levy statement. So, I'd say about 90% of levy statements are sent by email. It's not an exact science that email is delivered to each and every owner. There's spam filters, there's junk mail folders, there's antivirus firewalls, etc. There's many sort of filters on the way to getting an email through to owners. And certainly when a server sends out thousands of levy statements, as would happen, these volumes do tend to trigger spam filtering and junk mail folders, which then capture the levy statements outside of the client's mailbox. And sometimes they will not see their levy statement, and that will be an obvious reason why they're not paying their levies. So it's really important. It's a bit technical. There are ways and means of trying to counteract that, but certainly that's one of the main reasons that debt collectors should be phoning owners in arrears to double check that they have received their levy statement, that they understand it, and as I said, that they address any queries. If an owner has not received their levy statement, we will obviously resend it to them and then confirm to make sure that they have received it and that reason for non-payment has then been eliminated. All right, there was a question now about, why is it necessary for levies to be paid by the first in advance? As Karine said now, the legislation does not stipulate the timing, but I would say it's a norm for levies to be paid by the first in advance. Why is that the case and why is that important? I would say there are a number of reasons. The first is that many people are paid their salaries either on the 27th. Some government employees might be paid on the 25th. So very often levy payments for the next month are actually funded by salary payments, which are paid to owners either on the 25th or the 27th. I'm aware there are some government departments that pay on the 15th of every month, but I will come to that now. So because the income to pay levies is coming into owners' bank accounts on the 25th or the 27th, it's not a bad idea that levies should be paid by the first in advance shortly after while there's money to pay it. And remember now, these levy payments are competing with all kinds of other payments that owners are expected to be making, bond payments, other service payments, etc. So that's one reason that the charges should be paid when there's money to pay it. Another important reason is that many of the property costs, many of the building costs need to be paid in the first 10 days of the month. So security costs, cleaning costs, etc., all need to be paid at the beginning of the month for the prior month services. It's necessary that there are funds to be able to pay that, and those funds are achieved by levies being paid promptly at the beginning of the month. So that income timing of levy payments is matched to when the property's costs need to be paid to maintain service delivery to the building. So that's a second important reason. And then as Karine said, even though on each and every levy statement, it's very clearly written, levies should be paid by the first in advance, we do actually allow 7 days as a grace period for levies to be paid before the 7th. So levies then should really be paid between the 1st and the 7th for the reasons I've mentioned. And, it's only if they're not paid by the 7th that the debt collection process really starts, that the debt collection charges then are applied, and that would explain that timing and what is exactly expected. Now, the debt collection charges are really there as an incentive to pay on time, meaning that if the payment is before the 7th, there's absolutely no penalty charges, there's no interest, the owner's not penalized in any way. And therefore, it's a strong incentive to pay on time because the debt collection charges arise thereafter, after the 7th, and the charges are there to cover the costs of the debt collector's time, of the telephone calls, of the letters, and all of the effort that goes into the pre-legal process. And as you heard, all of those charges are provided for by the Council for Debt Collection. They're enforced by the Debt Collectors Act. And if owners are not happy, after we've tried to explain the charges, we've referred them to Trafalgar's debt collection certificates, the Council for Debt Collectors website, where the charges are prescribed and provided for. They're more than welcome, and we provide them the contact details for the Council for Debt Collectors, and they are able to then lodge a dispute with the Council for Debt Collectors that then independently reviews the levy account. It will ask for an explanation from the debt collection company concerned, and they will evaluate the merits of the client's complaint, and they then make a binding ruling in terms of whether the client's complaint is upheld and what that remedy should be. So that's just important to know that there is that escalation process. If I can just mention here that when Benazir was talking about leveraging centralized amenities, what we're talking about here is trying to use access to these facilities as a debt collection lever or incentive. So if somebody's not paying their levies and the building has a centralized hot water system with heat pumps, for example, it's quite possible to disconnect hot water from their unit until they've paid their levies up to date. So we're trying to create inconvenience for those owners, because all of these services are paid for by the levies, and the logic is that if they're not paying their levies, potentially they shouldn't have beneficial use of all of these building amenities. So the hot water example, it's easy to disconnect hot water to a unit because there's normally shut-off valves to each and every unit for plumbing repair purposes. The owner would still get cold water, or the resident would get cold water. They're not having a spoliation of a key resource, and the inconvenience of not having hot water, especially in winter, is a very powerful way to persuade owners to catch up their levy arrears, to pay the levy account, and to prioritize it accordingly. So each of these are explored on a building by building basis based on the setup of the building, what centralized services are available, and if it is possible to disconnect one or more of these, it's a very important persuader or incentive to catch up with arrear levies. So that's important. Now let's ask ourselves, what can caretakers do to assist the pre-legal collection process? And you know, some important points are reflected on this slide. For example, if we are not able to get hold of a particular owner, remember I said calling them is really important to check that they are getting the levy statement, that they are comfortable with the charges, that they don't have any queries. We need contact details to be able to reach out to the owners, to be able to make contact, and to be able to discuss those items with them. If we are not able to trace the owner contact details from the online tracing system, CPB, that Benazir mentioned, I think, very often it's helpful to ask a caretaker on site to go to the unit, to speak to somebody that's residing there, to see if they can obtain any contact details. So tracing contact details, a very important way that caretakers can assist with pre-legal debt collection. Caretakers can also double check that the owner's receiving their levy account, whether they've got any queries that need to be responded to, and they can give feedback to the debt collector on the managing agent side and relay feedback back to the owner, you know, if contactability is a problem. So, you know, that's really important. Caretakers can also find out if they're tenants in a unit, because if they're tenants, you know, they might then have the contact details for the landlord that they're paying. And there's also a CSOS rule that allows the tenant's rental to be paid to the levy account instead of the owner. CSOS can rule that as a remedy for levy arrears, and it would therefore be important to know that a tenant is in the unit to try and pursue that remedy for paying the levy arrears. So that also would be important feedback that a caretaker can assist with. The other thing is where there are utility queries, meter reading queries around charges for electricity and water. Again, caretakers can be very instrumental in trying to resolve those. For example, checking the meter reading to make sure that the reading is accurate, giving feedback to the owner about accuracy of the reading and how those charges are derived, and if it's necessary to send a service provider to check the meters, to calibrate the unit, or to inspect inside the unit, caretakers would be very helpful to assist contractors to get to the right meter, to inspect the meter and inside the unit, and to then give feedback both to the residents as well as to the managing agent. So that's very important in terms of utility queries, which is actually quite a big reason why owners do not pay their levies. Maintenance issues. So we find these are very often excuses, if I can call it that, or justifications that owners give for not paying their levies, and they often use withholding their levy payments as a way of protesting these various issues being resolved. So therefore, resolving these as quickly as possible is really, really important to try and eliminate, you know, the query and then expedite the payment. So with maintenance disputes, which again is a topical reason, caretakers can be instrumental in giving feedback to the portfolio manager or the trustees of, you know, what the maintenance issues are, where they are, how they recommend that they resolve, and then facilitating a service provider to come and address those. So from our side, you know, our whole mindset is to, you know, identify what is the reasons for the levy account not being paid, trying to address and resolve those reasons, and therefore eliminating any excuses for the levies not being paid. There was a good question about now, are owners aware of the debt collection process? So are they aware in advance to understand what will happen from a pre-legal collection process, and why it's important for them to pay on time. So, my answer to that is they should be aware, because the pre-legal debt collection process is explained in a welcome letter, which is sent to owners either when the complex is taken on for management by Trafalgar at the beginning, or it's also sent to new owners when they buy into a complex as the transfer goes through. And that welcome letter will also explain to them the levy account, how the levies can be paid, contact details for any service queries, etc. And there is a paragraph on the debt collection process. So it is covered in the welcome letter. And on each and every levy statement, there's a very bold message which said levies must be paid by the 1st in advance. And there's links to detailed payments instructions, and the contact details for the staff involved are on the top right of the levy statement. So those are the ways in which the information is communicated. And obviously when the debt collectors telephone the owners in arrears, that would be part of the discussion. The debt collectors would explain what will the debt collection process be if the levies are not paid, what charges will arise, and all of that is an encouragement for the owners to catch up as quickly as possible to avoid penalty charges and interest being raised on their account because of that. So possibly that's just some supplementary explanation on the whole pre-legal process. Right, so there are some questions which have come in. I just need to work through those, but I think I'm going to hand over to Joanne now, who is going to take us through the legal process. So remember now, if we've been through the whole pre-legal process, if all of those steps have failed to collect the levies, and even the soft collections applied by that attorney firm have failed, the only option we have then is to hand over that levy account to a firm of attorneys to commence with the legal collection process, which Janae now will explain and summarize for you, so you've got a fairly good idea of how this legal collection process works. So Janae, can I hand over to do that for us, and then we'll come back to the questions that have been raised in the meantime. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are now going to look at the legal collections. Firstly, we differentiate between defended and undefended matters. Okay, next slide. I will firstly look at undefended matters. After a letter of demand is sent to an owner and no payment or payment arrangement is received, the attorneys will draft and send a summons to court to be issued. The summons is then allocated a case number by the court. The issued summons is then received back and sent to the sheriff for service on the owner. Each sheriff has their own service jurisdiction, so the service address will determine what sheriff will serve the summons. Service of the summons usually takes a week, maybe 2. However, within the COVID pandemic, we have experienced a huge backlog on service of summonses. Once the summons is served, the owner then has 10 business days to defend the matter. This is done by serving a notice of intention to defend. If no notice of intention to defend is served, the attorneys can then apply for default judgment. Apologies. This is a judgment that is granted against the owner for non-payment of levies and usually will include an order for payment of interest on the arrear amount as well as payment of attorney fees. Each court has a different turnaround time to issue granted judgments. It usually takes a month or 2. However, with the COVID pandemic, we have experienced a lot of backlog on issuing judgments. Next slide. Once the attorney is then in receipt of the granted judgment, the attorney will draft and send a warrant of execution to the court to be issued. The warrant is issued against the movable property of the owner and will then be sent to the sheriff to execute at the owner's address. Where the owner's domicile address differs from his residential address, a tracer needs to be appointed to confirm the residential address. The warrant will then be sent back to court to be amended to the traced address. The sheriff will then attend the owner's address and draw up an inventory of the movable property found. The value of the movable property must at least be 5,000 Rand. If the value of the property is 5,000 Rand or more, the sheriff will attend to removal of the movable property. However, if the value of the property found at the property is not sufficient to satisfy the judgment debt, that would be where the property found is less than 5,000 Rand, the sheriff will issue a nola bona return of service. The nola bona enables the attorney then to bring an application to court to attach the immovable property, which will then be the unit in a complex, for instance. This application will then be sent to court, and a request will be made to have the unit attached and sold on a sheriff's auction to satisfy the arrear levies. Next slide. We now come to defended matters. If a summons is issued and served on an owner, and the owner intends to serve a notice of intention to defend within 10 business days of receipt of the summons, the matter then becomes a defended matter. After service of the notice of intention to defend, the owner has 20 business days to serve his plea. The plea is delivered to the attorneys who issued the summons and contains the owner's version of the matter. If the plea is not served within the 20-day time period, the attorneys who issued the summons will serve a notice of bar on the owner or his appointed attorneys. The notice of bar gives the owner 5 days to serve his plea. If the plea is not served within the 5-day period, the attorney can then apply for default judgment, and the matter will proceed as an undefended matter. If the plea is served and it contains a counterclaim, for instance, the owner makes a monetary claim against the HOA or body corporate, the attorneys will answer with a replication. The replication is the HOA or body corporate's answer to the counterclaim and plea, and puts the HOA or body corporate's version of the plea on record. After the pleadings are exchanged, each party must prepare a discovery affidavit to serve. The discovery affidavit will contain all the documentary proof that will be presented for trial purposes. For instance, levy statements, trustee resolutions, and interest resolutions. After the respective parties have exchanged discovery affidavits, the pleadings are considered closed. The matter is then prepared for trial, and a trial date is applied for by the attorneys. The next slide. Fees relating to collection by attorneys. Our panel attorneys charge a fee of magistrate's court scale plus 25%. This is more in line with prescribed management rule 25.4. Where body corporate or HOA elects to use their own attorneys, the fee is an agreement between the body corporate or HOA and its chosen attorneys. CSOS collection versus legal collections. It's important to note that where, for instance, in a default judgment, the court will make an order for payment of legal fees. CSOS makes no order as to cost for a payment by an owner. Each matter needs to be considered on a case-to-case basis due to execution of orders and fees involved. If there's no payment on an account, where an owner pays no amount towards his levy, it is always better to approach the court. However, where there is a dispute or a fine on an account, it's better to approach CSOS. CSOS is a more cost-effective way to deal with disputes or fines. Next slide. Okay, so at this stage, we have been experiencing a lot of problems since the COVID pandemic started. Prior to this, there's also been delays at court, and I'm going to look at some of our problem areas. The turnaround time to issue summons at court can sometimes take up to 3 weeks. Attorneys are also limited to the number of summonses they can bring to court to issue per day. For instance, some candidates can only issue 10 summonses a day. Judgment, there's also a limitation on the number of judgments that can be submitted on a day and the number of court files that can be requested. Magistrates also take long to grant judgment because of their workload or due to the number of presiding magistrates per court. Some of the queries we have been receiving regarding levy statements is that a levy statement must start on a zero balance. This is to ensure that the court can exactly see how the arrear balance has been calculated and accumulated since the account was on a zero balance. The court can also request specific resolutions for charges appearing on a levy statement. For instance, special levies or interest, or special levies or interest. The court can also request AGM minutes and proof of the notices that were sent to owners regarding levy increases. Next slide. The Sheriff's Office. The Sheriff's Office doesn't always serve as per the attorney's instructions, where a summons will usually accompany an instruction letter from the attorneys, and we have found that the sheriff doesn't always read the instructions and serve accordingly. We have also noticed that some of the documents come back with an error on where the sheriff typed in the wrong unit number or a surname has been misspelled. There's also a long turnaround time when it comes to removals of movable property. The Master of the High Court will take months to appoint executors in deceased estates and curators in insolvent estates. Unfortunately, when executors are appointed in deceased estates, they do not always have the knowledge to finalize estates, and the body corporate and HOA will then have to institute legal action against the executor to get a result of administering the estate and actually paying the levies. Next slide.
Coming up, sorry.
The Magistrate Court, since COVID-19 started, opened and has been operating since June. There is a huge backlog with granting of judgments, issued of warrants, and issuing of summons. The court, from June up until now, has also been closed on and off due to staff members testing positive for COVID. The High Court is currently closed to the public, and the High Court is currently using an online system that was implemented last year. So summonses is submitted via the case line system and is sent back to the attorneys with a case number. There is currently a 6-week backlog on this. The same goes for judgments. Judgments is submitted via the case line system and is then emailed back to the attorneys, and there's also about a 6-week backlog on this system. Next slide. The Sheriff's Office has been operating since June 2020. In the beginning, when the Sheriff's Office opened, the Sheriff was very uncertain on whether they could execute warrants, and this created a backlog. Sheriffs were not allowed to do removals and auctions, and as far as I know, only from the 12th of July have they started to do actual removals of movable property and auctions of immovable property. The Deeds Office has been open since the 13th of May. Some of the Deeds Offices from the 13th of May up until now have been closed a few times already due to staff members testing positive for COVID. Transactions ready to be lodged for registration at the end of March has been delayed as clearance figures ultimately expired. The attorneys are currently struggling to obtain clearance figures from the municipality, where they normally obtain such figures within 3 days. They are currently waiting weeks and weeks for this. Next slide. Okay, questions?
All right, thanks very much, Jonae. So I think just to emphasize, if it's not obvious already, that the legal process is a very slow one. And it's actually a lot slower now under COVID situations than it was before, for the reasons Jonae explained, in terms of many courts have been closed because of positive cases. Many courts are not allowing personal representation. Many courts are limiting the number of cases which can be filed, and all of that is now prolonging an already long and tedious process. When Jonae talked about the panel of attorneys, what we've done as Trafalgar is that we've made arrangements with up to 5 attorneys in most of our regions that are recognized debt collection specialists. They're so-called collections attorneys. They specialize in this area of law, and they typically have the systems and the trained staff to be able to handle these legal matters effectively and time efficiently as well. So we've built preferential relationships with these attorneys who then work as what we call panelist attorneys on cases that are handed over to them by Trafalgar debt collectors. Now, those different tariff structures, if I maybe just find the slide concerned, the tariff structures Janae was saying is the magistrates court tariff structure is actually a much more cost-effective tariff structure than the other tariff structures available. Here it is. So the panel attorneys are actually charging a much lower tariff because of the because they are on a panel working with Trafalgar, because of volumes of cases that they referred, and this obviously does save legal costs to the extent it's possible to do so, and it limits, you know, the charges that are now going to be recovered from that owner concerned based on judgment being made. Other attorney fees used, for example, some buildings do insist on their own attorneys being involved. Some have used different attorneys for a long time. Those fees are typically agreed in a fee letter, which is signed by the trustees on behalf of the building, and typically those charges can be even more than double what the magistrates court tariff plus 25%. So it's really important to try and obviously use an attorney firm that specializes in collections work, that has the capacity to do it time efficiently, that's got tested results, and also that the fees are as effective as possible and as competitive as possible. And where these invoices are coming in to be paid, so for example, the managing agent has sent the legal fee invoices from the attorneys to pay. Our debt collectors will check these charges to make sure that each item that's reflected on the invoice has actually been done, that it's noted on the notepad for the unit concerned as confirmation of it being done. We would then validate the charge is fair and correct to raise, and we'd make sure that the charge itself is correct in terms of this magistrate's court tariff plus 25%, and then fits with the fees which have been agreed. So it's important to check. So Janae, would you like to talk to just the way that these legal invoices are processed? So, you know, the charges are raised on the owner's levy account as a recovery because it's provided for in the management rules, and then, you know, who actually pays the invoice before the funds are recovered.
Okay, Andrew, so the attorneys will deliver an invoice to us. We check it and it's loaded on the levy statement of the owner. The body corporate and the HOA will be responsible for payment of the initial invoice. However, it remains the responsibility of the owner to pay the legal fees. So in our collection process, we will recover the legal fees from the owner. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think so. You know, and just to mention to everyone, there are cases now where in small buildings where there are significant levy arrears, it can actually happen that the building cannot afford to pay the legal fees. And that obviously becomes a very significant problem because the attorneys will not progress the legal matters if their invoices are not paid. You know, so if the invoices are not paid, and they might not be paid for cash flow reasons because the building can't afford it, the legal process can then stop and it completely stalls, meaning that the opportunity to collect those levy arrears through the legal process is completely compromised. And that creates a really deadlock situation where, you know, there's no money to pay the legal fees and there's no legal process to collect the arrear levies to then pay the levy arrears, and you get into a vicious circle. And the only thing we can recommend there is there's a product we have called Levy Solutions. There are other companies that provide similar. Propel is an example where the debt, the levy arrears, is purchased from the building, so they get a cash injection based on the levy arrears, and then the levy, the legal invoices are paid for by the financial service provider, so that cost and the cash flow of those legal invoices is taken out of the building's hands to resolve that issue I explained, where a building cannot afford to pay the legal invoices because it doesn't have the funds to do so because of the levy arrears. So hopefully that makes sense, but just speak to your portfolio manager, or the trustee should speak to the portfolio manager if that difficulty arises, and there are levy factoring products that can try and resolve that particular issue. So that's an important one to mention. Joanna, can I ask you just to explain to everyone, how do you monitor legal files for levy arrears? So what are you looking for? How do you know if it's been well managed and on track? And what would you do if you were concerned with delays?
Okay, Andrew, so what we usually do is we check our legal files at least once a week, all the handed over matters, to make sure that the attorneys follow the process as I explained earlier in defended or undefended matters. What we also do is, if we see that the legal process is taking too long, we will ask the attorneys to advise us on what can we do to escalate the matter, what can we do to heighten the recovery process to make sure that the attorneys proceed accordingly. So we monitor the attorneys to make sure that they follow the legal steps as they should. Collections, it's a very structured process that needs to be followed. Unfortunately, due to the backlog and the delays at court, it is almost impossible to say, okay, within a month a summons is going to be issued, within 2 months a judgment is going to be obtained. So unfortunately, that is the difficulty that we are having with monitoring attorneys. The only thing that we at this stage can do is to make sure that the attorneys follow the steps that they should follow, to make sure a letter of demand, summons, judgment, warrants, all of those steps are followed within a reasonable time frame, and that they are actually followed to make sure that their levies are recovered from the owners.
Okay, thank you. Just to mention that we arrange for all of our panel attorneys to have access to the property management system we use. We expect them to capture notes each and every month for all of the files that they are handling. That needs to give feedback about what's happened over the last month, what stage they are at in terms of these stages that you see here. And it's on the notepads that our debt collectors are monitoring the progress and the timing of each of these steps to make sure that it is proceeding in line with reasonable expectations. If there seems to be either no notes or an unreasonable delay, then the debt collector and the debt collection managers would then contact the attorneys to find out what is going on and how the delays can be resolved. So it's really important then to monitor those notepads, to check for the progress of these different stages, to have an idea of the time delays from one step to the next, so it's clear when there is an unreasonable delay, and then to quickly escalate that. So that monitoring and follow-up and escalation is really important to get the best results in a system which is completely overloaded and now completely sort of distracted by COVID, controls and regulations and cleaning and cases and so on. So, that really is what's happening at the moment. So hopefully that gives you a sort of short summary of the legal collection process. Benazir, can I ask you just to talk to the whole acknowledgement of debt process? So I don't know if we emphasized very clearly, but the whole point we're trying to achieve with the pre-legal process is to agree a payment plan with an owner in arrears in the format of an acknowledgement of debt, which then captures the time period over which they will pay their arrear levies. And that's perfectly, satisfactory. We try and then formalize it in that way so that, the system can be flagged accordingly and the process can be monitored accordingly. And most certainly with the economic disruptions of COVID-19, we've been ready and willing and promoting payment arrangements to defer levy payments, to spread levy arrears over a payment period, which can be anything from 6 to 12 months, and to give owners chance to catch up and breathing space to get back to work and to recover their earnings. So Benazir, can you just sort of talk a little bit further about the acknowledgement of debts, which the debt collectors are actually trying to achieve, and then how they monitor that over the repayment period?
Hi, Andrew. Yes, so what we try to employ is that most owners must sign AODs, and that is for the reason that they will be able to pay, a minimal amount as opposed to, a huge amount over a year. So what we do is we speak to the trustees, and, we obviously have to check our handover resolutions and follow instructions of trustees, but we do allow between 6 months and 12 months payment arrangements. We do try, and bend the rules a little bit where an owner is struggling to pay and they can only afford a certain amount. There will be no debt collection fees also or penalties added to the account. So I do urge, that when owners speak to the debt collectors, that they sign an acknowledgement of debt. And, we need to know that owners, are paying in good faith and are making every effort to make a payment. So, if an owner approaches me and they say, look, they can't pay over 12 months, but they can pay over a year and a half, we do look at that. We do mention it to the trustees. So I think it's very important that the AOD is followed as opposed to entering into the legal processes. That takes a very long time, and the owner will then suffer the legal fees that will be added onto the levy account.
Okay, thanks. I'd also just like to emphasize that we are very ready and willing to write off debt collection fees as an incentive for owners to pay the arrears. So very often we'll say, we're happy to write off 50% to meet owners halfway, and that would be an incentive for them to pay the levy arrears, even more than that. So, writing off debt collection fees is actually a standard practice. It's used as an incentive. And the top priority is to collect the arrear levies, not the debt collection charges. And the debt collection charges can be an important incentive to encourage owners to pay, at the appropriate time. Just in terms of monitoring it, if the owner commits to a payment plan, ideally in a written acknowledgement of debt format, but many owners will not reply with a signed acknowledgement of debt. The debt collectors then need to diarize the date of that payment promise to pay, and they will need to follow up to make sure that the payment is made as promised. If an owner breaks a payment plan or breaks a promise to pay and probably breaks it a second time, those would be strong grounds to hand over for legal collections. Joanne, can I ask you, in terms of handover, just talk to what value of handover is standard practice. When would it be warranted to move from pre-legal to legal in terms of outstanding number of months of levies, the value of the outstanding levies? And you can also talk to the handover resolution as well that the trustees will need to sign to authorize that legal handover. Joanne? All right, I seem to have lost Joanne.
Can you hear me?
Now we can, yes.
Sorry, Andrew. Okay, so once an account has been handed over for soft collections or where the internal collections fail, and the owner is at least 3 months arrears of levies, and the soft collection and internal collections fail, we then hand over to the hard collection attorneys, which will either be a panel attorney or an attorney chosen by the HOA or body corporate. We do advise that we do not hand over accounts that are less than 5,000 Rand in arrears because of the amount of legal fees. It's not always logical to hand over an account where the legal fees will supersede the amount of the judgment amount. We will then rather reapply our resources to persuade an owner to enter into a payment arrangement. So in basic terms, 3 months or more, but at least 5,000 Rand in arrears. Pertaining to the handover resolution, we provide a handover resolution to trustees. This handover resolution mandates Trafalgar to hand over accounts to attorneys and to make sure that the attorneys follow the collection steps that they are supposed to recover the arrear levies. I don't know what other question, sorry, Andrew, what other question was there?
No, that covers that, thanks. There's a relevant question for you here, Joanne. For the removal of assets by the sheriff of the court, whatever the movable assets might be, must the caretaker building manager give the sheriff access to the property or the unit?
Okay, so let me answer that question. by giving you an example. If the sheriff attends a estate or complex multiple times and the sheriff does not get access, firstly, he will not be able to make an attachment, and secondly, the recovery of the levies will then be delayed. So what I do advise is, if the sheriff does attend an estate or body corporate, that the caretaker gives the sheriff access. Yes, I think, Benazir, if you can maybe just assist me there, I do think that the caretaker can assist by giving the sheriff access, on the condition that the sheriff presents the caretaker with either the summons or the warrant that he has in his possession to give him the instruction to attend the complex or estate.
If I can just add in there, Andrew, it's very important that the caretaker assists the sheriff. What we've had in a few of our estates is that the security refuses the sheriff to access, to gain entry. And it really is important that the service is carried out properly. So we can put the summons onto the door, so that is an alternative. However, we do often call a estate manager or caretaker to, when the sheriff is attending, we instruct the attorneys to call them and ask them to allow them entry into the body corporate. So I think it's imperative that, they assist in that role. Sheriffs are legally allowed into body corporates. There's nothing precluding us from letting them in. So I think that's an important assistance that we can get from the caretaker. Because security are often an obstacle that we have. The sheriff will, provide us with the note saying that they could not gain entry because the security didn't allow them in. And that is something we have to overcome, because the summons has to be served onto the owner personally or put onto the door, depending on whether a domicile address is provided. So, that is a very important step in the legal process.
Thanks, Benazir. We've got quite a few questions about these controversial points here about leveraging centralized amenities, or when I was talking about trying to use these other levers to incentivize owners to pay their levies. I don't know how many of you have worked in buildings where the trustees very often want to disconnect electricity or water to a unit where the levies are not being paid. And there was another question about not doing maintenance around a unit. Now, it is controversial. I would even say it's not strictly legal, or it probably is not legal in certain cases. And let's just take a couple of examples. So if as the managing agent, we are asked to disconnect electricity or water to a unit because the owner has not paid their levies, we will not be able to assist them because that is illegal. It's called spoliation. An owner could go to court. They could go to court on an urgent basis on the basis of spoliation to get an order to reconnect their water or electricity, and they would win that order, and the building would then have to pay costs because of losing. So, that is the legality of the situation. There are many buildings where the trustees nevertheless decide that they want to disconnect electricity because it is very powerful to persuade owners to pay. Very often owners with disconnected electricity will pay their arrear levies, and many of them potentially either don't have the knowledge or the resources or the energy to follow a legal process. So it certainly can be effective. What we would typically say to those trustees is that we can't be involved because of legalities, because of reputational risk, because we can't be involved in illegal actions, but the trustees may choose to instruct an electrician or a plumber to do it directly, and they would then give the instructions. They would take that legal responsibility, and they would do it at their risk. So there are many buildings where the trustees step in, they take charge, they give the instructions to service providers, they do it at their risk, and the electricity and the water is disconnected accordingly. And as I've said, that is generally very often effective, and they very often get the result that they're looking for, which is the owners paying the arrear levies to have those services reconnected. But there is risk because it is illegal, and there's risk of a costs award being made against the against the building. So, maybe that just clears it up. The same point about maintenance. So yes, in many cases, a building, the trustees may say no maintenance services may be provided to an owner in arrears or around that owner's unit. It wouldn't be strictly legal, but it could be effective, and the trustees could use a delaying tactic to stretch it out to try and create pressure on that owner, and all in the effort to try and persuade them to catch up their arrear levies. And I'd say some of these points here are debatable, and Karine, you can remind me if I'm wrong, but I believe there are court cases, there are judgments on record where some of these measures have been ruled illegal and they were not authorized. So disconnecting centralized TV, hot water, because there would be cold water supply, I'm not sure it's strictly illegal to disconnect hot water, and so on. But the point is here that in the short term, trustees do try and create inconvenience and pressure around these disconnections to persuade owners to pay and then to catch up. If there's a legal challenge, they may very well back off and restore that, but they've created pressure in the meantime anyway. So Karine, can you maybe just comment on what legal judgments there are in this space in terms of spoliation, just clarify what is allowed and what's not?
Andrea, the only one I know of offhand quickly is one for access control, where an owner was refused access to a complex, or refused to his access card was disconnected, and they basically said that amounts to spoliation. I don't know offhand of any other court cases.
Okay. All right, thanks. So I do know that water and electricity themselves cannot be disconnected because of spoliation, although it is done from time to time by the trustees, and it is very effective, if I can just say that. Hot water, I think, is more achievable, but many buildings don't have centralized hot water supplies from heat pumps. Most would have geysers, and then it would not be possible to interrupt hot water because there's only a single cold water supply into that particular building. Karine, can you just answer this question here? So Nico is asking about, what can one do if, trustees are lobbying towards the acceptance of various cosmetic projects, which are kind of delaying more important projects being done? And, how does one make sure that the levy budget is correctly approved, that the levies are paying for the valid, correct, and necessary expenses in a building, and where maybe the trustees are not following due process in terms of applying an AGM approved budget?
Yeah, so basically the AGM approves the budget and the trustees have to follow the budget. They can't go outside of the budget. If they do, then either you can replace the trustees, get new trustees that will follow the correct steps, or you can take the trustees to CSOS because they are not following what the owners have approved.
Okay. Maybe Nico, just a few other points is that, as you've heard, the budget is approved at the AGM, and that's a formal approval process. It's not possible to lobby owners after the AGM to change the budget, because the budget can only be approved at a general meeting by an ordinary resolution. So lobbying and piecemeal decision-making after the AGM doesn't cut it in terms of changing a budget and the expenses that were forecast and provided for in the budget, which is a directive to the trustees to restrict their spending activities within the context of that approved budget. The maintenance plan that we spoke about in a previous module, so the 10-year maintenance plan is supposed to map out the longer-term preventative maintenance required at a building over the 10 years ahead. It's updated annually, and typically that, if it's compiled by a professional service provider, should map out priorities, costs, scope of work, etc., and to make sure that the maintenance is structured in that way. And as you know, that reserve budget is approved at the general meeting. In a similar way, the reserve levies are linked to that maintenance plan, and that should be the way that the significant maintenance is actually planned and executed in a building. And it's all regulated through majority votes at the annual general meeting, which to some extent should control the way that the trustees might, lobby or deviate from that budget. Karine, can you just talk to the directives on trustees? So if there are, important points that owners would like achieved in a building, let's say a building, there's safety gaps in terms of emergency lighting or handrails or whatever, how would one go about getting a directive voted at a general meeting to stipulate that needs to be attended to by the elected trustees?
Yeah, Andrew, so basically at any general meeting, there must be an agenda item, directions and restrictions to trustees. And this item can then be used by any owner. It doesn't have to be voted on. Any owner can stand up and say, I want to direct the trustees in a certain way, or I want to restrict the trustees in a certain way. And for instance, there you can restrict them in terms of maintenance projects or any projects where they're not allowed to spend a certain amount or over a certain amount on any project without consulting the owners first. You can put directions on them to say, I want the trustees to investigate a better way of securing the complex in terms of putting up an electric fence or whatever they need, they deem necessary to better secure our complex, or basically anything. Any owner can stand up at a general meeting and put a direction or place a restriction.
Is that voted on as a ordinary
No.
resolution to agree it? Or
No,
is
it's
it
not.
literally, you can just stand up and say, I would like X to happen, and that becomes
Yes,
an
you can.
automatic directive?
Yeah, you can just stand up and say, I want X to happen, and it's minuted, and the trustees have to investigate. The trustees can always come back and say, we have investigated, it's not possible. But it is not. It doesn't have to be voted on.
Yeah. All right. And then Nico is just raising a point about lobbying that happens before the general meeting to persuade owners to vote in one way or another, and then, basically questioning the validity or the correctness of that lobbying. So I suppose that's just life in terms of
That's life.
voting system. So, yes, there is lobbying that happens, and that might make sense in terms of managing expectations, growing support, getting people to understand what they'll be voting on. And, ultimately every owner casts their vote, in terms of making decisions. And if the lobbying is effective enough to achieve a majority vote, then unfortunately it does carry the decision, because the owners have exercised their rights to vote, and whatever influenced them to vote one way or the other isn't always easy to control. And it does explain that proactive trustees that go to those lengths to do that can influence decisions in that way, but unfortunately it's within the voting parameters provided for by the legislation. Is that right, Karine?
Yeah, Andrew, it's not just trustees that can lobby for votes. Owners can also lobby for votes. So if you have something that you feel is very important to you and you want to push it through, go and lobby for votes. Get as many people to vote with you as possible. It goes to the meeting. It's a democratic voting process, and whoever gets the most votes will win.
Okay. All right. Look, well, we're out of time. In fact, we're 5 minutes over time. So just in closing, thanks very much to everyone who's joined us this afternoon. I hope you found this topic interesting, relevant. I hope you've learned some of the legal steps and the pre-legal steps as well. If you have any further questions that weren't answered this afternoon, please don't hesitate to email myself or Karine. Hopefully you've got our details, but my email address is andrews@trafalgar.coza and karinec@trafalgar.coza. We'll be glad to try and answer your questions. I will circulate the slides and the recording links probably tomorrow afternoon once it's uploaded to those that have asked before. If you still need it and you haven't received it by Thursday, please let me know by email. And then we look forward to you joining us next Tuesday for the last module of training on frequently asked questions and utility recoveries and meter readings. So that'll be our last step, and we hope that will draw a positive close to our 9-module Caretaker training series. So good afternoon, everybody. Thanks once again. Have a good evening, and we look forward to seeing you next Tuesday afternoon. Bye-bye.